Hi guys, welcome to another episode of Pointy Not Sharp. Today we're taking a look at a really cool and quite hard to track down bayonet that I've been tracking down for a long time. This is a Indian Indian 1A bayonet. Now, pretty much a copy of the UK L1A4 bayonet, except you can see this one's got a particularly long blade. They came in both a short and long configuration, and here we've got the long one. Now, these bayonets were made for a number of different rifles in Indian Surface, the 1A and the 1A1, which were just essentially SLRs with a couple of differences, and the 1C, which was the full auto version of that rifle. Now, while the rifles were made by a couple of different manufacturers, the bayonets were made by a rifle factory in Ishapur, and I think they were, from what I can tell, they were made between 1963 to about 1997 when production stopped, but they might have stopped production earlier if they had built up a surplus. In total, it appears that about 1 million of the rifles were made, so likely a few more than 1 million bayonets were made than that. So I'll jump into a little bit of history. There isn't a terrible lot to say about these, but in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the ARDE, which is the Armament Research and Development Establishment in India, they started examining and evaluating various FN FAL style of rifles. So they got some from Australia, Britain, so the two SLR versions, other than Canada, they weren't included for some reason, and metric FALs from Belgium. And they disassembled them, had a look at them, and they came up with their own design, which actually incorporated some of the parts from the older SMLEs, which they still had in service and likely still had a lot of tooling for. Now, they couldn't secure a license with FN because FN had too many restrictions in place. They wanted to send 750 technicians and engineers over to do the work in India. They wanted royalties on every rifle produced, and India wasn't a fan of those conditions. So they decided to just start making the rifles and bayonets in secret. Naturally, FN found out, and they were absolutely furious when they found out. They threatened a lawsuit, and the president or prime minister, I forget what India has, at the time claimed ignorance. He wasn't aware of what was happening. So to appease FN, they just made an order for a bunch of weapons from FN, like metric FALs, Mag 58s, weapons like that, a few more as well. And that settled the matter. Now, along with the rifle, we get this bayonet. So this is similar to the British L1A4 bayonet rather than any others. I don't have an L1A4 to show you. I've got an Australian L1A2, which has some similarities and some differences. We'll go through that when we talk about the construction. Now, as I said, there's two versions of this, one with a long and one with a short blade. And in Ian Skinson's book, British and Commonwealth Bayonets, he has images of one with a press button similar to the Australian L1A2 with this kind of proud press button, but this was not the standard that you would see on the rest of the Indians. So I'm wondering if maybe that was either an early production one, or perhaps it was something that wasn't standard. I don't really know, maybe a trials or something like that. Now, these rifles and bayonets stayed in service for some years. It wasn't until 1998 that India replaced the FAL with the INSAS, and that was essentially like an AK in 5.56mm NATO, and that came with like a really poor quality AK solar bayonet, which unfortunately are not very common on the collector's market because I'd love to get my hands on one. Now, jumping into the construction of this bayonet, as you can see, we have our long blade with a Bowie point at the end, which is the same as what we have on the British and Australian with that classic style of blade. We have a sharpened true edge. We have it's not a sharpened false edge, and then we've got a rounded spine. We've got squared fullers on both sides of the blade, and really quite a dark blue. And this wear here is from the spring, the internal spring. So that's not a two-tone bluing of the blade or anything like that. This one's a little bit greasy, so it's a bit reflective for you guys. But moving down, we've got our little crosspiece or cross guard, whatever you want to call it. Now, in Skinson's book, he states that there were two versions, those with a straight wall leading up to the muzzle ring and those with a wasted or a recess in here. This is the wasted kind. I have yet to see a straight wall one, but I'll take his word for it. Then we've also got a little hole down here at the base. Now moving down to the grips, our tang goes all the way down to the pommel. We've got two wood grip panels which cover the top and bottom of the tang like the number 5 bayonet. And it's retained by two flathead screws, in this case going from right to left, but I've also seen them going from left to right, so I don't think it's terribly standard. Moving down to the pommel, this is where it really resembles the L1A4, or the British L1A4. So the L1A1 and L1A3 both have pommels that are brazed and heat shrunk onto the tang. But the L1A2, like my Australian one just here, and the L1A4, like that in British service, have two very well disguised rivets that are machined down, polished, and blued over, so they're very difficult to make out. But they are there. Then the other difference is our recessed catch. So in 1958, the 1st of December I think it was, the British introduced a change to their bayonets, and they came up with the L1A3 and L1A4 where they have this recessed button, which makes it more difficult for a protester or someone like that to remove the bayonet from a rifle when they're standing in front of a bunch of soldiers. Honestly, there's not that much of a difference. You can still readily press that, but hey. Then we just have our standard T-slot mortise, and we've got a little screw there for retaining our press button. And I've got to say, this blade is actually quite sharp. When I was positioning that, I could really feel it on my finger there, like I was about to cut myself. So I should probably point out that Indian steel is no joke. You hear Indian manufacture, you assume it's going to be crap. And a lot of the time that's true. But their steelwork in the 1960s and 70s was actually world class. So earlier than that, in the 40s and 50s, they were relying on imported British steel, blanks for barrels and bayonets and things like that. But in the 50s and 60s, they got a whole bunch of experts from the USSR and the UK to come down and help them establish their own steel industry, and they did a fantastic job, and they made some really, really good stuff. So while a lot of the fittings and finishings on Indian weapons is usually quite trash, the parts that matter, like barrels and bayonet blades, are usually really, really good quality, despite the fact that they're not very well finished. A lot of tool marks. That's the bayonet. I'll move down to the scabbard. Now, these long scabbards are actually really hard to find. You'll find the bayonets far more commonly than you'll find the scabbards. So to be able to examine this one today with the scabbard is really, really nice. So we've just got a sheet steel scabbard, painted black. We've got a drainage hole down at the point. You'll see it's sort of got more of a rounded tip than the Australian sharp ones do. More like the British ones. We've got a round frog stud that's just been like brazed on there. You can see a little bit of brass under there. And then we've got a brass throat. So it's like a number 5 Mark II bayonet, retained by a simple flathead screw. This one is quite dark and needs a good clean, but that's part of the history and the character of this bayonet, so we're not going to touch it. Now, the overall length of the blade, the long ones like this are 254 millimeters or 10 inches long, while the short ones come in at 200 millimeters or 7.875 inches, a little bit shorter. The muzzle ring diameter is really quite small, coming in at 14.7 millimeters. Finally, we'll look at the markings, and we don't have a terrible lot, unfortunately, which is always a bit sad. But on the left ricasso, we've got RFI, which is the manufacturer, Rifle Factory Ishapur, and then next to that we have a 2-digit date of manufacture. Here we've got 66 for 1966. Other than that, we have a couple of serial numbers on the right pommel. So it appears that we've got one that's been scratched out and one that's been put on top. So usually these appear to be 4-digit serial numbers. So we've got 1095, I think it is. And below that, one that appears to have been scratched out. Unfortunately, they're the only markings. We don't have any on the scabbards. And that's really all I know about these bayonets. There's a lot of reproductions and fakes out there. They're mass produced in India. And look, they're pretty cool. just don't be fooled by them. If you're going to buy one, buy it, because it's a reproduction for an appropriate price. I've got no problem with them. I think they're neat. I'll probably get one at one stage if I'm in the right place at the right time. But yeah, the real ones can be mistaken for reproductions from time to time. Anyway, that's all I've got to say, guys. If you enjoyed the video, please feel free to drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already, because I've got a lot more interesting videos coming. And thanks for watching.